into NFL Live coming out of Cincinnati, and as has been expected, with 24 hours to go before the tag deadline, wide receiver T. Higgins has been tagged for the second year in a row. He is just the second wide receiver to be franchised twice by the same team. The other was Chris Godwin, who signed a long-term deal with Tampa shortly after he was tagged a few years ago. And this was T. Higgins' response, quite simply, tag. Adam Schefter joins us now. Adam, what more can you tell us?
Hannah, this was the expected outcome in the T. Higgins situation that still is unfolding as we speak. I don't think we've heard anything close to the last of the T. Higgins situation, but this marks the second straight year that the Bengals have used their franchise tag on T. Higgins to take him really out of unrestricted free agency. It's a $26.2 million franchise tag, and the Bengals were quick to point out that their intent is to work towards a long-term deal. Now, my understanding is the two sides at this time are not close to a long-term deal. On the open market, T. Higgins would command north of $30 million a year. The franchise tag number right now is 26.2. So clearly there is work to be done between the two sides, and were he to hit the open market, there would be a team that would be paying him $30+ million a year. But the Bengals right now are not willing to do that. So we'll see if the two sides can figure out their differences, but this is one of any number of issues the Bengals had this offseason. They still want to get a deal worked out with Jamar Chase, but the focus for now is on T. Higgins. They still have to deal with Trey Hendrickson, who led the league in sacks last year and wants a new deal. Plenty of financial issues in Cincinnati, but they have now placed the franchise tag on T. Higgins.
So they have taken the first step as Dan Orlovsky and Mina Kimes join us now. Dan, let me start with you. What are your thoughts about this move?
Makes sense. I just don't know how it's going to end, and that's going to be the fascinating part. And Schefter knows a little bit more than me, but to my mind, it's like one of three things can really happen. Number one, that T. Higgins plays on that franchise tag and signs it. I just feel like that's unlikely. Number two, this gives them more time in Cincinnati with T to get out a long-term deal that gets signed. Or three, and I want to see if this is when it gets really interesting, is does it be a opportunity or become an opportunity where they trade him and now he just doesn't walk out of their building, but they can use that franchise tag as a way to give a team an opportunity to put together a package that they want to use to trade for T. Higgins and then sign him, because I just don't see how Cincinnati can sign T. Higgins, Trey Hendrickson, and Jamar Chase and field any type of competitive football team moving forward.
Yeah, especially because, Dan, all of the needs they have on defense. I mean, I was just looking at the roster trying to figure out what positions they should target in the draft. Every position is one that they have to get better at on defense, right? Defensive tackle, edge, opposite Hendrickson, linebacker, cornerback, safety. They all have needs. So if they were to try to get a deal done with Higgins, and I understand the impetus given how successful they've been in offense, they would have to have the draft of their lives in Cincinnati to get better on that side of the ball. As far as the tag and trade option goes, I agree with Dan. I'm interested in seeing if there's any reports of interest in the next few days or the coming week or so, because there is great need on a number of teams that have a lot of cap space. And with Higgins off the market, if Chris Godwin were to stay in Tampa, it's not a great group of receivers. And Dan and I were talking about this too. It's not a particularly great receiver draft. So if I'm a team like the Patriots, the Commanders, the Chargers, I'm calling and seeing if it's a possibility. I'm not saying it's going to get done, but I'm just calling to see if there's a possibility.
That's exactly what is going to be going on across the league right now. Again, the Bengals have not advertised their intentions other than trying to get a long-term deal worked out with T. Higgins, which is what they should be saying, because number one, they should want the player, but if they can't get a deal done, then they should be looking to deal T. Higgins. And there are people across the league who believe that this could wind up being a tag and trade. Now, we don't know whether that will happen, but I can tell you that there are people around the league who believe a tag and trade is possible here with T. Higgins, despite the fact that the Bengals have said their intent is to sign him to a long-term deal.
The timing of all this is so fascinating, though, because with free agency a week away, essentially, in the NFL, Jamar Chase and Trey Hendrickson are going to have, obviously, markets. And so you can't wait that long to figure out the potential trade partners if you're Cincinnati and the likelihood of that long-term deal getting done, because you can't allow those other two guys to potentially hit the market. And I think the priority for Cincinnati has to be Jamar Chase, Trey Hendrickson, and then T. Higgins, as much as I love T. Higgins. So the timing's fascinating. The other part is this. T has a very specific body frame and role. And so if they come to a point where we're not going to get a deal done with T. Higgins, one, you have to get draft capital for this year. I don't care about draft capital in the future, this year. And then two, they got to really go after and find a receiver that does replace a little bit of that body frame that T has because of the style that Joe has in throwing guys open. You're looking at a 6'3", 6'4", 6'5" type of receiver to try to replicate how big of a productive player T. Higgins has become.
Much more to come on this story. Much more work for the Bengals. We should mention they also released guard Alex Kappa today, and in doing so, they saved $17.6 million in cap space. The deal becomes finalized March 12th. That's the start of the new league year that Dan just referenced. And here is what Deebo brings to DC. He is a yards after the catch aficionado. Deebo averaged over 8 yards of yak per catch last year, the highest among wide receivers, and that just so happens to be a weakness for the Commanders. Washington ranking no higher than 21st in the NFL in yards after the catch per reception last season. So we have another weapon for Jaden Daniels. Adam, what more can you tell us about this trade and how it got done?
Listen, Deebo Samuel and Kyle Shanahan talked during Deebo's exit meeting at the end of the year, and I think both sides recognized the fact that they would be moving on from one another. Deebo requested a trade. He was allowed to seek permission to go seek a trade partner. There were a few teams that expressed varying degrees of interest in Deebo Samuel. The Houston Texans checked into it. The Denver Broncos checked into it. But the one team that really stayed on it was the Washington Commanders. The Washington Commanders general manager is Adam Peters, who came over from San Francisco. And it's interesting because the Commanders always had wondered whether or not it'd be worth adding Brandon Ayuk to team up with Jaden Daniels, being that they played together at Arizona State. But in the end, they do go for a 49ers wide receiver, but it turns out to be Deebo Samuel, somebody that can complement Terry McLaurin, make the offense better, give them another weapon, and they don't have to give up much compensation. I think a lot of people surprised to see just a 5th-round pick in return for Deebo Samuel, but you have to remember that they're taking on Deebo's full contract, over $17.5 million, and that is why the 49ers could not get more in return for a player who had meant so much to the 49ers franchise over the year. Instead, Washington gives up a 5 and gets another weapon for Jaden Daniels.
Yeah, as he joins scary Terry McLaurin, and he's so multifaceted. Mina, how do you see Deebo fitting into Cliff Kingsbury's plans?
Perfectly. I mean, this is like a no-brainer, honestly, when the deal was announced. First thing that comes to mind, Dan, I'm sure you had the same thought. Cliff is going to call a million screens. He already called a million screens. He loves tagging those RPOs with bubbles, tunnel screens. Look, Deebo Samuel might not be what he was a few years ago. He still breaks tackles better than most receivers, and he's still more elusive than most running backs. So the yak you get from him is incredibly enticing. And then the other thing I would highlight, you talked about his versatility. The Commanders, when they used 2-back sets, 21 personnel, they had the highest EPA per play of any team in the NFL last year. Now imagine putting Deebo Samuel back there, as they did in San Francisco. Suddenly you're getting personnel mismatches. You get him on linebackers. This is a team that loves to use no huddle, so defenses can't substitute. I just think it is a seamless fit for this offense based on what we saw last year, Dan.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense for me. If I had to use a phrase to describe Washington's offense, it's pace and space. That's kind of their bread and butter and who they want to be. Mina talked about it, and we've talked about it for a year now. The pace on offense, that no huddle, and then the space that creates, sometimes because of the tempo, sometimes because of how wide their formations are. And when you combine them together, that's why you get so many of those perimeter screens. No quarterback in the NFL threw more perimeter screens last year than Jaden Daniels. So you're talking about potentially lining him up in the backfield and giving him the ball, absolutely. But then you're also talking about being in this no-huddle offense and giving a guy the ball on the perimeter right now that is as good with the ball in his hands out in space as anybody in the NFL. And there's a simplicity to that is so simple for an offense and a quarterback. I do think that Washington is fascinating, though, MK, because of this. And I loved Washington last year. I want to give them their flowers and credit them. I also don't think that they can fall into the trap thinking they're that close. 5 wins on the last play of the game, essentially, that's not likely in the NFL. And so while they're encouraged and intriguing, they're not one Deebo Samuel away from chasing down Philadelphia. There are still flaws in this roster that they got to have a very much so like attack mindset and not resting on the success of last year mindset.
Yeah, they just have to look back sort of to the Houston Texans, right? And how they shocked everybody, high expectations. But that schedule also gets tougher. A lot of things happen in that second year. Dan, thanks. The Jets finished 5-12 last season, their 9th consecutive losing season, the worst record by an Aaron Rodgers-led team in his career. New York announced they would be moving on from Rodgers back in February. The 41-year-old won't be able to agree to a deal with a new team until free agency does start next week. So, what about the receiver that came there to play with him? What about Davante Adams? The Jets traded for him in October. He has 2 years left on a 5-year, $140 million deal. He won't return as the Jets quarterback. Davante Adams, again, with 2 years left, and after all those years in Green Bay, Adams has really struggled the last 5 seasons with quarterbacks not named Aaron Rodgers. He's averaged almost 2 fewer yards per target and has caught just 57% of the passes thrown his way, down from 72% when he was catching them from Rodgers. Adams catching passes from the likes of Derek Carr, Aiden O'Connell, Jimmy Garoppolo, Gardner Minshew. So, Adam, what is the latest on Davante's future with the Jets?
Listen, from the moment the Jets announced that they were moving on from Aaron Rodgers, the full expectation was that Davante Adams would not be back in New York with the Jets. The only question is, could they find a trade partner for his salary? The issue is, what team out there is going to be taking on Davante Adams' contract? It is hard to imagine that would happen. The Jets always can hold out hope that maybe some team could do it, but the overwhelming probability is that was never going to happen and that they're going to wind up releasing him. That's been the full expectation across the league. Really, it's only a matter of time before it happens. And then Davante Adams will be free to go where he wants, sign where he chooses, pick a home that he will be playing in 2025. But unless there's some unexpected trade that happens to materialize at the last moment, the Jets always were going to be moving on from Davante Adams once they moved on from Aaron Rodgers. And so we'll see where Davante Adams surfaces. Again, let's just go back to Deebo Samuel. The 49ers had a hard time finding a single team that was willing to take on his $17.5 million salary. This is a salary that's double for an older player. It's just very hard to find that at this time of the year. So the overwhelming chances are he's going to be released, he's going to be a free agent, and he's going to be finding a new home at some point here in the next couple of weeks.
And who knows if Aaron Rodgers plays somewhere, maybe they get together again. But Dan, regardless, who should be interested in at least exploring the notion of Adams?
I think going back to Green Bay makes sense. I think the Pittsburgh Steelers and try to find somebody competent opposite George Pickens. I'd also say the Denver Broncos. You know, Davante still averaged over 12 yards a catch last year, had 7 touchdowns. And while we can all sit here and respectfully say, no, he is not the Davante of old who was the best receiver in football, if you're a football team that's looking for, a good 2 or a really, really good third pass-catching option, Davante Adams clearly can still produce exactly what that role is needed. So Green Bay, Pittsburgh, Denver are the 3 teams that come to mind for me.
I would also throw in the Chargers because I think that offense is going to flow through Ladd McConkey, but having him on the perimeter would be really helpful. Dan, I was sitting at a bar in Indianapolis and the Ravens-Raiders game came up. If you think Davante Adams still doesn't have something to offer, put that game on because it was a reminder. He can still play and he can still give you big plays downfield. So I do think there are going to be options for him, likely as a cut candidate, as Adam alluded to. And then I think for the Jets, you have to suddenly start figuring out, okay, what does this roster look like in this post-Rodgers, Devontae Adams world? Wide receiver is a need, but it's not the biggest need. I would put offensive tackle, safety, tight end above that, and then obviously they got to figure out what they're doing at the quarterback position. So they might have to go bargain hunting at receiver maybe later in the draft, or a free agent like a Josh Palmer, if they were to switch places with the Chargers, might make sense for them, more of a possession guy, but it is not their biggest need. And then Garrett Wilson becomes the focal point moving forward.
Right. I mean, as Mina just said, Dan, they have so many needs. They have the 7th pick in the draft. What should this new regime at the Jets be focused on?
Garrett Wilson. Mina just said it. I would try to get Garrett Wilson signed to a long-term contract. I don't care who's been playing quarterback. The young man has produced. And for what seems like nothing's gone well for them, he's been sensational. I want him. Number 2, I got to rebuild my lines of scrimmage. Not necessarily. I think the offensive line's got a chance to be a little bit better, personally, than the play last year. The defensive line, specifically the interior. MK, I don't think they chase quarterback in the draft, me personally. I actually think if you could get Justin Fields to come there, it makes a lot of sense. Maybe he's not the future, but maybe he is. But you also don't rush into a 8th pick quarterback or 7th pick quarterback and make a decision that's probably not going to be beneficial for the future.
Yeah, they only have 2 quarterbacks on the roster right now. That's Tyrod Taylor and Jordan Travis. All right, we are just getting started. Lots going on. And Adam?
Well, Hannah, you're going to see a multitude of players be released this week as teams try to save money against the salary cap. One today came in Philadelphia with the Eagles releasing 6-time Pro Bowl cornerback Darius Slay, who finishes his Philadelphia career winning a Super Bowl, playing well. But the Eagles are moving on and saving about $4.3 million against the cap. He's designated a post-June 1 salary cap release. Meanwhile, Justin Fields continues to talk to the Pittsburgh Steelers, as does Russell Wilson, and the Steelers are trying to see if they can get one of their quarterbacks re-signed for next season before free agency begins. Right now, the Steelers don't have a quarterback under contract. They'd like to get one of their own quarterbacks re-signed before next week's even hits. And meanwhile, the Dallas Cowboys would like to get a deal done with Micah Parsons, but a deal at this time doesn't seem close. We saw last year Dallas doesn't move quick on these particular deals. CeeDee Lamb went into the summer. Dak Prescott lasted until the first day of the regular season, but clearly they'd like to get a deal done with Micah Parsons, but that deal does not appear to be close at this time. In the interim, they're more focused on Osa Odighizuwa, their defensive lineman, who could wind up getting the franchise tag by this time tomorrow. The deadline is 4 o'clock Eastern on Tuesday for players to be tagged. We've already seen Kansas City guard Trey Smith be tagged, Bengals wide receiver T. Higgins be tagged, and Osa Odighizuwa would be another player that we're watching by Tuesday's 4 p.m. Eastern deadline for a potential franchise tag.
To say the Cowboys move slowly in negotiations, that was an understatement there, Schefter. And they did struggle last season, ranking in the bottom 5 in points allowed, total QBR, and yards allowed per game. They were the top 5 in all those categories in 2023. But, of course, one area where Dallas defense looked really good, getting to the quarterback. They had the 3rd most sacks in the NFL last season. That, of course, is thanks in large part to the aforementioned Micah Parsons. He had 12 sacks. Obviously, Mina, signing him long-term should be a top priority here. How does a big contract for him, in your estimation, affect the rest of their offseason?
I don't know what's so hard about this. You take the top edge contract, I believe it's Nick Bosa, and then you add some money. Boom, done. I did it, Dallas. It's like not that hard. So the Cowboys right now have no money, right? But there are a lot of moves that they make, a few moves rather, to alleviate that situation pretty quickly. Right now, Dak Prescott has a $90 million cap hit because he's got a ton of salary in the future. You can convert that into a bonus, bring it down to just over 50. Same thing with, well, not the same thing, but with CeeDee Lamb, again, you can convert a lot of his bonus to contract, bring that down. And then if you do deal with Micah Parsons, that's similar to what I just said, which is basically the Nick Bosa deal. Plus, you actually can bring his cap hit down a decent amount too, because right now it's got him on the tag. You do those 3 moves and suddenly you're at over $60 million in cap space. Now, it would mean you are tying your fate to these 3 players and that you want them to be the future of the franchise, not just in the next couple of years, but even beyond that. But if I'm Dallas, I feel good about that. I think they're three really good football players. And then you do that, you have a little bit of flexibility to move around and address some of the other positions on the roster.
Yeah, that's fascinating, MK, because if you look at their roster and their free agents, they're not in a good place. I mean, they got to try to re-sign DeMarcus Lawrence. Brandon Cooks is a free agent, so they're going to need somebody else opposite and or outside of CeeDee Lamb. Rico Dowdle, who I actually thought did a nice job last year and would be my starting back if I were them, is a free agent. Chauncey Goldston. So, there's a lot of question marks of important players that they have to try to re-sign. And unless they do some of those cap moves that you're talking about, this is a football team that's going to be even more so devoid of talent. Obviously, the interior of their defensive line has got to be a focal point. But I feel like 2 years ago, MK, it was fix the interior of the defensive line, you'll be fine. I think there's a lot more holes to this roster than we thought 2 years ago.
I think something that's going to be really key to whether or not they're in good shape going forward is internal development on the offensive line. Because looking at the roster, I see a lot of the needs that you talked about, and I think they can address some of those in the draft, particularly like wide receiver, maybe find a defensive tackle. But the offensive line is where they've already invested a fair amount of draft capital, and if a player like Tyler Guyton can take a step forward, he got to play a lot last year at left tackle. If you feel good about Brock Hoffman and Cooper Beebe, on the interior, then suddenly you have what very few teams in football have, which is a cheap, good offensive line. So to me, when I think about this roster and I think about what shape they're in, I think about making all these moves, so much depends on the development of that offensive line, because that's what's going to give them flexibility to do other things.
Yeah, they do have the 12th overall pick in the draft, but this is just the 7th time since 2000 that they've even picked in the top 15. It'll be very interesting to see what they prioritize there. All right, we have some other news today off the field. Jimmy Johnson, who won 2 Super Bowls with the Cowboys in the 92 and 93 seasons and a national championship with Miami in 1987, has announced his retirement as a broadcaster at age 81 after spending 31 years at Fox Sports. He will forever be remembered for one of the most famous speeches.
How about those Cowboys?
It brings Cowboy fans together no matter where you are, no matter who you are.
How about them Cowboys?
When you hear that, as I said, you either love or hate the Cowboy fans, and it's usually warm in my heart when I hear that.
This is a live shot of the Dallas Cowboy locker room. Head coach Jimmy Johnson handing out congratulations to the Cowboys with a 30-20 victory today over the San Francisco 49ers.
Did that just happen? We just beat the 49ers. We're going to Pasadena. We're going to play in the Super Bowl.
Listen up! Hold up! Hey!
And here comes Jimmy. He's celebrating, and we're all hugging Jimmy, which never happened.
Fantastic! Every single one of you. So I got up on the table, and I was just ecstatic. I don't mean to put a damper on it, but you understand, we do have one game left to play. For some reason, I just says, and the only thing else I got to say is, how about them Cowboys?
Those 4 words from Jimmy Johnson stamped an exclamation point on an epic climb.
We were 1-15. We took over a team that had 3 straight losing seasons. We took over a team that was 3-13. I felt like the 49ers were the best team in the league that year. If we could get past the 49ers, then we were going to win the Super Bowl. Because if you're going to beat the 49ers, you're going to beat Buffalo the next couple of weeks.
How about them Cowboys?
Jimmy just had this energy and this fire about him. I don't know if that comes off anyone else's lips. I don't know if it's the same.
You said you're standing on a table. I've been in that locker room. That's not a very big locker room.
You don't realize I'm quite an athlete now. It wobbled a little bit, but I kept my balance.
Jimmy, he had so many great speeches over the years in team meetings and locker rooms after big wins, and most of those aren't captured on tape. That one is, and it's become a catchphrase for Cowboys Nation.
Dallas went on to win 3 out of the next 4 Super Bowls, and those 4 words remain the rally cry. for former players.
How about them Cowboys?
And fans.
How about them Cowboys?
I was visiting my two sons in Austin, and we were at a little dinner restaurant, very nice, but I saw some heads turning, and so we were walking out of the restaurant, and one guy looked up at me and he says, "How about them Cowboys?" I wish I'd have patented that or put a trademark on it. I didn't do it.
Yeah, no kidding. Maybe could have retired earlier had he done that. Jimmy Johnson releasing a statement earlier today, and I'm just reading it in part here. And it, quote, "The most fun I ever had in my career, that's counting Super Bowls and national championships, was at Fox Sports, but it made an extremely difficult decision. I've been thinking about it for the last 4 or 5 years. I've decided to retire from Fox. I am going to miss it. I am going to miss all the guys." And Jimmy, on behalf of all of us here at ESPN and NFL Live, we are going to miss you too. Your expertise, at times your empathy, your willingness to tell the truth, and your sense of humor. So how about that, Jimmy Johnson? To be made for a few teams, but back with Schefter, the Bengals made their decision today. All right, keep everybody updated. What do we know?
Kind of the Cincinnati Bengals for the second straight year have used their franchise tag on T. Higgins. The price for that tag this year is $26.2 million. Now the next question becomes, can they get a long-term deal worked out with him, or do they look to tag and then trade him to a team that offers up compensation and is willing to pay T. Higgins more than the Bengals are? There are still questions despite the fact that T. Higgins now has received the franchise tag. Meanwhile, the Kansas City Chiefs have used their franchise tag on offensive guard Trey Smith. Was tagged last week, informed of their decision. You could only imagine of the interest that might have existed on the open market in places like Chicago or Tennessee for a player of Trey Smith's capabilities, but alas, the Chiefs recognized that, did not want to make their offensive line any further weaker, and so they put the franchise tag on Trey Smith. Doesn't look like he's going anywhere. And now the big question will be what the Vikings do with Sam Darnold. They're going to take this up till the deadline. It certainly seems in trying to get a deal done. My sense is, reading between the lines, the Vikings would like Sam Darnold back in Minnesota. Sounds like the franchise tag might be a bit high for what they're looking to do right now. They'll keep trying to retain and re-sign Sam Darnold. Personally, I'd be surprised if the franchise tag is used on Sam Darnold, but the Vikings still have a little under 24 hours to make a decision about how they want to proceed. We'll see whether or not they tag him. Again, my guess is no, he does not get tagged, and we'll see if Minnesota can find a way to keep him there along with J.J. McCarthy.
Fascinating, Adam. Sam Darnold was terrific in his first 16 games last year. He ranked in the top 10 in record total QBR, yards per attempt, off-target percentage. But as you'll recall, he really fell off in those final 2 games of the season, losing big to Detroit in Week 18 with a chance to clinch that #1 seed, and then another ugly loss to the Rams in the wild card round. Now, this is new on NFL Live. Star wideout Justin Jefferson on the McAfee show today and asked about the quarterback situation.
I'm not sure who the quarterback is going to be. And just like I said last year, it truly doesn't matter personally to me. It doesn't matter who's going to throw me that ball. I'm going to make the most of my opportunities. So, creating that connection with the quarterback, no matter who the quarterback is going to be, that's the main part. And just having that confidence in each other when it's all said and done and it's getting crunch time, they know who to come to.
Hey, this is a great day for this discussion. We have 2 of Sam Darnold's biggest fans here, Mina and Dan. So, Mina,
truth tellers, Hannah. We call ourselves the truth tellers.
Oh, because I thought you were called the Sampathizers.
Yeah, that as well. Yeah, I get called a lot.
That was my understanding. I wasn't going to bring it up, but here it is. We have the Sampathizers. Mina, I'm going to start with you. He's 27 years old. A resurgent year for him, a career year for him. What should they do?
Crazy. First of all, just crazy to hear his age and remember how young he is, right? So there's still even potentially more development to be had. I had to get my sympathetic angle in there. So I think for Minnesota, I find it most likely that they're going to move on. And a lot of that has to do with the market for Sam Darnold. I think he's going to make more than the franchise tag. And if you're the Vikings and you've got that young quarterback in J.J. McCarthy, you probably don't want to sign him to the sort of contract he's going to get on the free market, quite frankly. You'd like to take advantage of JJ's rookie contract to do some work elsewhere. Now, a lot of that has to do with their own internal evaluation of McCarthy. How is he looking coming off of the injury? How has his rehab been? What is he like in the building? They know things about him that we on the outside don't know. But if they feel as good about McCarthy as they did when they took him relatively early in the first round, Dan, it's hard for me to imagine them wanting to pay Darnold the kind of contract he's going to get out there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And everyone talks about it, and you kind of referenced it. It's Sam versus JJ. No, it's not. It's Sam versus JJ and like $30 or $40 million for other players. And if the real question for Minnesota is, do they think that JJ McCarthy is going to become production-wise similar to what Sam Darnold was within the first year as a starter? Because if they do, then the answer is an easy one for them organization. No matter how much you love Sam, you let him walk. I also think Sam's vantage point of this one is very interesting, MK, because think about it from his perspective. He went through quarterback hell his whole career. Just awful place after awful place. Finally gets to a good place where scheme and play caller and the people around you are awesome. And he has the success that he wants. And it's a fine line between going to get your money and just chasing the money. It doesn't matter like what else is a part of that decision. And if you're Sam, you certainly want to go back to Minnesota. But what happens if you sit there and go, well, Minnesota is offering me this and Vegas is offering me a lot more, but obviously Vegas is not as comfortable and as supportive as a situation. I think the fascinating part for Sam is going to be how much does he really want the max value versus how much does he like that situation he's in?
Yeah.
Well, maybe he could find both somewhere if it was the right place. And he made his first career Pro Bowl. It took 7 seasons, finished top 10 in MVP voting. It was just perfect for him. We'll see. And while we wait for that domino to fall, we're going to head to Los Angeles where the first domino fell, or I guess actually it didn't really fall. This is new on NFL Live. Here's Sean McVay on keeping Matthew Stafford.
I think the important thing throughout this was the end goal in mind was always to have Matthew back as the quarterback. There was never any dispute or discrepancy on that. But we didn't want to we want to make sure we had all the information necessary and didn't want to have to do things in secret or whatever you will. There's a lot of narratives that were out there, some of which was accurate and a lot of which are probably not necessarily accurate based on how things can get lost in translation. All I cared about was our dialogue throughout. So that was really important. And I think that was key and critical for us to be able to have, a smooth process throughout that might have seemed uncomfortable from the outside, but I think it was able to come to as good of a scenario as I could have hoped, honestly, when we met together on Friday morning.
I like those nice, simple bookshelves, by the way. Just footballs. Kind of says it all, doesn't it, with his background. They've got their quarterback. They've got a run game. They've got this great young defense. Dan, listen, they had a great season. They came within a breath of beating the Eagles. Where do you put them among the Super Bowl favorites going forward?
Yeah, right now that's the second best football team in the NFC, in my opinion, and right behind the Philadelphia Eagles. Detroit, obviously very good. Green Bay, I want to see what happens with both coordinators in Detroit, Green Bay. I want to see them solidify some other pieces. And I know that, the Rams, they're not a complete team right now. Obviously, the draft and free agency coming. What are they going to do with the situation with Cooper Kupp? I think they are a fascinating team to watch in the draft again. Last year, this is with a team that tried very hard to go up and get Brock Bowers. And maybe there's not Brock Bowers, but there's a Tyler Warren out of Penn State, and he's probably going to be a little early for them, but do they get aggressive for him? There's a Colston Loveland out of Michigan, who's a very, very good tight end and had an outstanding weekend at the Combine. If you are the Rams and that's the spot you want, I could see them getting once again aggressive because they know that this is now a, 1 to 2 year window to go win another one.
Yeah, and Sean McVay has been using more 2 tight end sets last few years, 12 personnel, so I could see him wanting to upgrade at tight end. I'm going to go the other side of the ball, Dan. I really think this team needs to invest at linebacker. They have not over the last few years, but they're in a division with the San Francisco 49ers, who will be better next year, and then a conference with those Philadelphia Eagles, with teams like Detroit. I think the linebacker position has outsized significance in the NFC because of those teams that you're competing against. You have to be solid, better against the run. You look at a team like Philadelphia and what they got out of Zach Bond this year. They need to find their Zach Bond. So that's something I would focus on in the draft if I was the LA, in addition to maybe looking at free agency and seeing if you can get better at the second level of your defense.
Yeah, they have the 26th pick in the draft. But Adam, can we go back for a second to something that Dan was talking about? So the Rams had informed Cooper Kupp that they would be trading him, but what can you tell us about that situation?
Again, Hannah, these wide receiver deals are not easy to do. There's salary that you have to account for, and is there another team out there that's willing to take on the contract of Cooper Kupp right now? And the answer so far is no right now. And so the Rams are waiting to see whether there's a team that materializes that is willing to trade for Cooper Kupp's contract as it is, get back pennies on the dollar, or whether they're going to have to release him. Again, the public hears the name Cooper Kupp, and they know what he's done, the Triple Crown, and they're waiting to see if the Rams can trade him. And then they're surprised when the compensation isn't what people think, or they wind up having to release him. People saw the 5th round pick for Deebo Samuel. They don't understand. Well, this is a similar situation, and it very well may wind up with the Rams having to release Cooper Kupp, allowing him to become a free agent, and then having him be able to pick his new team.
Yeah, this seems to be a theme. You said the same thing about Devontae Adams as well. So Cooper Kupp, right? 3rd in team history in receptions, but could be let go. Really interesting to see. Overall pick, and their head coach Brian Callahan, who was at the Combine and answered questions about his team's draft process.
I think we're trying to get the best player, period. And whatever that looks like for us doesn't make any difference to me. I want as many good players as we can find, and it's my...
Well, if they're going to take the best player, period, as Callahan said, that's either Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. But they're in a really good position because all of those options are on the table for them right now.
Yeah, by the way, they don't have their 3rd round pick this year. They traded that to the Chiefs for L'Jarius Sneed last year. Okay, let me go to Cleveland. The Browns hold that 2nd overall pick, and here's their general manager, Andrew Berry, on how he's evaluating quarterbacks.
I'll say number one, it's not an easy, evaluation. I think it first starts.
Significant time next season. Should the Browns go quarterback at number 2?
If Cam Ward is there, absolutely. If Cam Ward is there, I think the Browns sprint to the podium for 2 players. If for some reason Tennessee or somebody else doesn't take Cam Ward, then sprint to the podium and select Cam Ward with the 2nd pick. If Cam Ward goes number 1 to Tennessee, and I believe he should, sprint to the podium and take Travis Hunter at number 2. And I would play Travis Hunter on offense. I know a lot of people sit there and say play Travis Hunter on defense. Respectfully, when I watch Travis Hunter, I think of Randy Moss and Tyreek Hill. When the ball is in his hands, and that's said with as much respect possible, specifically to Randy Moss. And so while I sit there and Abdul Carter and all that, if either of those players are there and you're the Cleveland Browns, I think you're very happy with either of those players.
Well, so you would go the other way, Hunter on offense, where, by the way, this wide receiver market, he would stand to make some significant money if he has.
I would play Travis Hunter on offense. I can play him on defense at times. Right. I think you can say, hey, go play defense and play that guy in man coverage easier than you could teach him all your routes and your concepts and your splits and your cuts. And when I watch the guy with the ball in his hands, I go, why would I not want that 10 times a game?
Wow, love it. All right, let's go to the Big Apple. The Jets will pick 3rd overall. GM Joe Shane was asked about their plans at quarterback, and here's what he had to say.
Tommy DeVito is our only quarterback on the roster, so you may evaluate both of those. Those both may be options. So
we all love Tommy Cutlets, and may he have a long and prosperous career. What more can you tell us about what they're planning on doing at quarterback?
Well, they're going to add a quarterback, if not 2, during the offseason. And obviously, people have been talking about Matthew Stafford, who wound up back in Los Angeles. The Giants explored it, as they should have, and tried to get down on it. It didn't work out. Now they go on to the next plan of action. And in their next plan of action, Aaron Rodgers will be one of the veteran quarterbacks that they investigate. Sam Darnold could be another. And then, of course, I think the Giants will be aggressive in seeing whether or not they can move up in the draft to number 2, maybe number 1. The Titans have yet to make a decision about what they want to do at number 1, whether they're willing to stay there. But the Giants could wind up adding a quarterback in free agency, trading up in the draft, sitting at number 3 and taking a quarterback. There's a lot of different ways this still can go, but one thing is certain. They're going to be adding multiple quarterbacks this offseason, with Tommy Cutlets being the only quarterback currently on their roster.
Too good.
It's going to be a fun 8 weeks, man, listening to Adam talk about all these options on the table. Okay, so my thoughts on the Giants are remarkably similar to what Dan just said about the Browns, only they're picking behind the Browns. But I think there's 2 things I would seriously consider for them. One, jumping the Browns to get Cam Ward. Draft capital, really, it depends on what it would take. I don't know how much competition that they would have, but I do think the Titans would be very willing to just go down one spot because of the way this draft is shaking out and their need to add draft capital. So I would consider that. The other thing I would do is, if Travis Hunter was there at 3, I would take him and not reach for a quarterback. I just would. I think he is a generational player. I don't think this is a team that is a quarterback away. I would look into free agency and maybe consider a bridge, which might not be aligned with the priorities of the GM. But to me, what would be best for the long-term future of the franchise would be to take the player that I have so much more conviction in, and that's Travis Hunter, regardless of what position he plays, by the way.
And Mina, this is exactly why Tennessee is going to be taking its time and not rushing into a decision, because they know back to 2, they can trade back to 3. They have to decide whether or not they feel strongly enough about a player like Miami quarterback Cam Ward before they decide what they want to do with the number 1 pick. If ultimately they decide that Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter is the pick, it'll be very simple to move back 1 or 2 or maybe both spots in the draft. They could trade back to 2 and then trade back to 3 if they wanted. Maybe they just go straight back to 3. But this draft, of course, starts with Tennessee. It's in the first spot. And because they were late to hire their general manager, Mike Borgonzi, and because they restructured their front office, they're a little bit behind some of these other teams. And that means they're not going to rush into any decision about what to do at number 1. We may see a trade of the number 1 pick. I would imagine we wouldn't see it for about a month from now at the soonest, because Tennessee wants to be very thorough in everything it's doing and exhausting all possibilities before it signs off on deciding whether to keep or trade that number 1 overall pick.
If Travis Hunter falls to the Giants at number 3, I'm going to fix the Giants in 10 seconds. Go draft Travis Hunter, sign Aaron Rodgers to a 1-year deal, start him the season, and then in the second round, draft Jalen Milroe at Alabama in November, make him your starting quarterback, and unleash quarterback run onto the NFL with him.